It's the Bible Geek, Robert M. Price.
It's time for the Bible Geek. Robert M. Price. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, baby. God blast them on the spot. Ghost, yes, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek. Interpretation, startle, Jesus, homiletical, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Been away for a few days working on Holy Fable, starting on the chapter on the Psalms. Oh boy, a lot of fun stuff there. Well, let me just once again hit you up for some support if you're able and interested in doing so. Boy, those creditors are wolves at the door with precious little to feed them. Anyway, you've fed me some great questions, and let's get right to them. This is from Bo, the self-styled apostle of spam. The Bible will always hold a special place in my heart as an immensely interesting piece of ancient literature with bits of wisdom scattered among its pages. I'm not a Bible scholar and or critic by any stretch of the imagination, but I have read it cover to cover 6 times, besides studying and examining different sections for countless hours. And am you sure you're not a Bible scholar? And am currently working through it for a 7th time. The first 5 times I read it as the inspired word of God, hallelujah, but on the 6th reading I began questioning that notion upon reaching Genesis chapter 11, and I completely dismissed it by the last chapter of Judges. I had been told, feed your faith and your doubts will starve, but when I fed my faith with the Bible, my faith starved and my doubts thrived. Approaching the 7th reading, I viewed the Bible as a human product from the very beginning, and it has helped me gain a much deeper understanding of the text. However, there is one factor that makes me think that there is a slight possibility that at least some of Scripture is truly inspired. It involves the Pauline epistles. If whoever wrote the epistles wasn't inspired by God, how did he manage to write such amazingly long run-on sentences? If God didn't inspire him, how did he remember the beginning of the sentence by the time he reached the end of it? Maybe I'm just dense, but sometimes I have to read these sentences multiple times, cutting them into small chunks to understand them. Some say the longest sentence is in Ephesians 1:3 through 14, which appears in some Bibles, and possibly in the original Greek, working out of the Kingdom Greek interlinear by Jehovah's Witnesses, to be 1 sentence. The whole chapter is just 2 sentences. What are the geeks' thoughts on this? Is there a mnemonic trick for mentally processing these passages the first time through? Are run-on sentences common in other Greek literature of the period? Let me pause there. That I don't know. But I think the long sentences in Ephesians, which diminish in length until you get to about the middle of the book, the long sentences seem to be just a stylistic peculiarity of whoever put Ephesians, which I think originally was the Marcionite Laodiceans, together in the first place, as Edgar Goodspeed showed beyond reasonable doubt, in my opinion, in a fascinating book called The Key to Ephesians. The whole of Ephesians is a bunch of bits and pieces from the other Pauline epistles minus the pastoral epistles, which hadn't been written yet, and a few bits and pieces from the Greek Septuagint, that virtually everything in it is a paraphrased bit of these other sources. And I guess that the long sentences result from an attempt to string the disparate pearls together sort of like the ancient narrative technique of having a character travel from place to place just as a way of connecting originally different incidents that were located at different places. So you get a travel narrative. Obviously, the Gospels are set up that way. I think this might be a kind of grammatical equivalent. Also, you might think of an old-time ransom note where someone has cut the various letters or words out of different magazine ads and so forth and put them together, so there's no handwriting to check. I think that's kind of what these long sentences in Ephesians are. They're bits and pieces cobbled together into a new Pauline epistle. Okay, back to Bo. Also being raised a Jehovah's Witness, I was taught that the central theme of the Bible is the vindication of Jehovah's sovereignty and sanctification of his name by means of the kingdom. From what I've researched, other religions view grace and salvation as the central theme. I've come to the realization that there isn't truly a central harmonious theme, but if there was, I would propose the following central theme that I've gathered from my reading of the text. People tend to screw up. People with authority, including God, tend to screw up more. There are so many verses that deserve an "oh, God damn it" interpolation. Genesis 6:7. Byington. Have a hunch that's a voice I'm supposed to do, I'm not sure. And Jehovah said, "Oh, God damn it, I will obliterate off the soil the men that I created, men, cattle, reptiles, and birds of the air, for I am sorry I made them." I guess that's a translation. Okay, 1 Samuel 15:10 and 11, American Standard Version. Then came the word of Jehovah unto Samuel, saying, "O God damn it repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments." And Samuel was wroth, and he cried unto Jehovah all night. What would be the geek's central theme to the Bible? Peace and goodwill upon all fellow Bible geeks. I'm with you. I don't think it's particularly helpful or informative to try to synthesize some overarching theme, despite the trend popular in the 40s and 50s of summing up the central message of the New Testament, Joachim Eremius, or the unity of the Bible, A.M. Hunter, so on. I don't think there is the message. All the salvation stuff really is making the tail wag the dog. That's a theme in the New Testament, not really in the Old Testament, which hardly has anything to say about an afterlife, which is, of course, what salvation is usually thought to be by moderns. Let's see. Yeah, it is a common and important motif to speak of the vindication of God's glory, but I don't know. I mean, there's so much else to it. I think this is an example of an essentialist or logocentric fallacy. It reminds me of what Anderson says in the movie The Paper Chase. I've not yet reached the point where I can reduce my outline to a single sentence. Yeah, there's no way. It's very difficult when you look at just trying to sum up the center of Pauline theology, and forget it. It's just they're all inadequate as soon as you say them. Who we got next? Raphael Calsaverini. I hope I'm saying that right. Greetings, O Geek. I bring you questions from the deep jungles of Brazil again. Concrete jungles in this case, as I write from the chaotic realms of Sao Paulo with tons of steel and concrete over my head. Still standing, I hope, right? You don't mean you're under a collapsed No, I guess not. Okay, I've been reading Bart Ehrman's book, Lost Christianities, and some of the comments he makes about the Acts of Paul and Thecla surprised me a bit. I'd like to ask Geek's opinion on them. The first question is about a report by Tertullian that the book was forged by an Asia Minor presbyter who was caught in the act and convicted by a church tribunal. Ehrman seems to be very confident that the report is genuine and that Tertullian, otherwise considered by many to be not as trustworthy on historical matters, is really reporting fact in this case. My impression is that the story told by Tertullian is too convenient for his aim of disqualifying the Acts of Paul and Thecla as scripture. That without some very good reasons, it's not more believable than other stories related by him. What's your opinion on this? Well, traditionally, I think most most scholars think this. And so, Bart is in concert with them. But there is one big problem. I think maybe it was Dennis MacDonald who pointed this out. I'm not sure. But and this item is also used by many to say, well, there couldn't have been forgery tolerated in the early church, so if it says it's by Paul, it must be, and so on. This presbyter was supposed to have been caught in the act of forgery, but that doesn't really make any sense. The book is not attributed to Paul or to anybody else. What's the forgery claim? It seems to me it's just, if anything, the original complaint must have been that the guy was just writing something deemed heretical, but I tend to that's not quite what Tertullian says, and I tend to agree with you. I mean, he could have been just compiling what he thought was, I imagine he was, what he thought was an accurate account based on the stories he had heard and so on. And MacDonald, in his really, really fascinating book, The Legend and the Apostle, The Battle for Paul in Story and Canon, he shows that the book seems to be based on oral traditions, things that the writer didn't cook up, and he gives you various structural arguments and so on for that. And I think maybe he's the one. I'd have to check again, but I'm too lazy to put it on pause and go across the room to check that it was not a pseudepigraph because there's no authorial claim at all on the thing. Okay. Raphael continues, the other question is related to the cult of Thecla. Ehrman mentions that the cult of Saint Thecla was once so popular that it rivaled even the cult of the Virgin Mary for a vast number of Christians. What is the evidence for this? It's surprising for me that such an important saint in early churches might become such a minor figure today. Well, I think he's right about that. I know there are several different versions of the Thecla story, and I'm sure there are various manuscripts, and there's a Lovecraft scholar in Germany today called I think Thecla Zachrau. So the name has survived over the ages, and it's not like she's unknown and has been rediscovered. It is sort of surprising. Of course, there's several other women like this in the Apocryphal Acts. Mygdonia, Maximilla, and so on and so on. But I think she even appears in a couple of manuscripts of one of the pastoral epistles. And I think he's certainly right. She once was very, very important, and I wouldn't be surprised if she has new supporters among Christian feminists. Fascinating figure. Okay. Last question in the book, Ehrman points out how a few of the Apocryphal Acts books preach one kind of chastity gospel or another. The Acts of Paul, of Thomas, of John are three examples given. Is there any evidence the canonical Acts of the Apostles embodied similar doctrines that could have been later redacted? Is this theme common in other Apocryphal Acts, or are those three particular examples not representative of the whole genre of Christian Acts in this respect? Oh no, they're real typical, and he's just given examples because you can certainly find the same thing in the Acts of Peter and the Acts of Andrew, big time. And I think there is a hint that this was known to the author of the canonical Acts, because it says in one of Paul's trials where he's speaking before Festus or Felix or Uncle Fester or whoever the heck it is, it says he spoke concerning this and that and self-control. The Greek is enkrateia, self-control implying chastity and continence, and that was the term used in the Apocryphal Acts, and the movement to which this refers was known as that of the Encratites. I mean, there was an official named group that supposedly Tatian founded in the 2nd century, but the Manichaeans were at least small e Encratites, and various Gnostic groups, any of them that mention the subject in the Nag Hammadi texts, were Encratite in that sense. So this was very widespread in the early church for a couple of centuries, and I suspect that's what's being mentioned in the last chapters of the book of Acts, where Paul has preached of enkrateia. Yeah, thanks, Raphael. Let's see, this is set observations more than questions, but there's a bit of that in it by Karim Gantus. He says, I don't mean to be topical for the sake of it, but the issue of same-sex marriage is a very interesting one. I do have some thoughts about it, and if they're relevant, I welcome public criticism from you. My point here is that the issue needs discussion, not that same-sex marriage is right or wrong. I'm curious that social progressives believe that serious issues like abortion and same-sex marriage are not subject to debate, and that we should accept them by default as fundamental human rights. Yeah, that is a real interesting point. You mean you can't discuss it? If you have a different view, you're a Ku Klux Klan cross-burning, lynching bigot? I don't accept that. Yeah, okay, let's see, number 1. The most interesting statement about marriage in the Bible, as far as I know, is Ephesians 5:31 through 33. I'll cite it here for convenience from the King James Version. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. Thanks, Apostle Paul Lind. It is clear, though not explicit, that marriage as a concept, only has validity between a man and a female, a male and a female, that is, according to the author of Ephesians. It's quite likely that the authors of the other New Testament documents would agree without giving it a thought. Yeah, but the problem is, it's just like the old thing, Genesis speaks of Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. It doesn't necessarily forbid what it doesn't mention. Right? It's the same problem with abortion. Abortion simply does not come up in the Bible. And you can make inferences that I personally would agree with, that abortion is murder, but it doesn't say that in the Bible, if that's the question at issue. And I think the same thing here. There are all kinds of like would the biblical writers have imagined a nuclear family, with just mom and dad and the kids and the dog, whatever. I doubt it. That doesn't mean they would have been against it. Things change. Would they have thought that male-female marriage should be based on romantic love? I doubt it. But we've developed that, and it enhances it. So that doesn't really seem to me to have much weight. Yeah, of course, they're talking about the common view of marriage at the time. Of course, there were plenty of people that thought homosexual relations were fine. I mean, it was an even divide, pretty much, among the ancients that said anything about it. But that they just didn't put it in terms of marriage. Nero married a young guy who was his servant, so I guess it wasn't totally unheard of. 2. Ephesians 5:32 says, "This is a great mystery." Perhaps this line of thinking is what made the Trinity doctrine easier to evolve. The Trinity, a sort of union of three persons of the same nature, is taught as a mystery. Could be. I mean, it is certainly a retreat to the same thing. It's tough to figure out, but that doesn't mean it's not true. It's a mystery. 3. Same-sex marriage, by the above definitions, is therefore meaningless. I don't mean to say that it's wrong, but if I were a Christian, I'd have to conclude that it's without any meaning whatsoever, and I'm therefore surprised that any Christian denomination would actively support it. But credulity is contagious, is it not? You said in a recent podcast that same-sex couples can raise kids just as well as anyone, and I agree completely. I suppose if marriage makes people happy, as meaningless as it is, perhaps it's not worth worrying about. Yeah, you'd have to show it's harmful, and some people would argue that a kid needs male and female role models, and therefore this doesn't work. I'm in no position to judge that. I only know that when I saw a gay couple who had adopted a kid and were in the process of adopting another, they seemed to be classic parents. But I can't generalize, from that. But makes me think it's not impossible, and maybe it's common. I don't know. 4. Jesus says in Matthew 23:24, "Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel." Much of society celebrated the American Supreme Court's decision. By all means, let people celebrate what they like, but this issue is surely a distraction, is it not? Are there not much more meaningful problems to solve? It was very interesting that the White House was lit with floodlights not too long after the court's decision. I guess those floodlights were just sitting there. It's a distraction, but everything's a distraction from everything else. I often think with these ASPCA and Humane Society ads, I say, look at this poor suffering beast. Don't you want to do something to stop this? And you think, well, really, that is a shame, but shouldn't I give the money to cancer research? I don't know. I mean, I guess as the spirit moves, right? I mean, everything. Every individual should feel his or her calling, so to speak, in an Aristotelian way. But I don't think you can really make that decision for people, which is one thing I don't like about one of the many things about Peter Singer's ethics. He said way back when that wouldn't it be better not to build the Sydney or Melbourne? I think it was Sydney Opera House. Rather, you should just give the money to the starving poor. Well, of course, if you did that all the time, you'd have nothing but the starving poor. Do you want the whole world to sink into that? Nobody's going to tell me what my priorities are. 5. There's much talk of Christian compassion. But compassion cannot be a blanket sanction for every interest group's concern, surely. Then again, the court's ruling adds rights and does not take away any. But as a counterpoint, diluting a concept can be the same as limiting it. I guess I just think that if more people are going to get married and enter into ostensibly stable relationships, I don't see how that threatens marriage. I know people respond, well, it blurs the lines. You could marry a child and somebody connected with NAMBLA or something, almost immediately filed for legal permission to do that. Or how about polygamy? Doesn't it open the door to legalize that? Well, I don't know if that really matters. These things have to be discussed and fought out, each on its own merits or demerits. I don't think a judgment on one automatically applies to the others, which are not exactly They're not enough alike to be settled by the same principle. They're analogous, but they really require their own treatment. Like I don't have any problem with gay marriage, nor with polygamy. I think that as long as there's a decent opportunity to provide for everybody in the multiple marriage, like presumably loads of Mormons do, or in Utah it's sort of benign neglect. There's a lot of polygamy still going on. I say, what the heck? It's none of my business. Now, if they're cheating off of the welfare system, well, that's wrong, but it's not a moral wrong, at least not in terms of the meaning of marriage. I would have a lot of trouble with marriage between an adult and a child, though. I don't know if that's ever going to become popular, but you would have to debate it on each issue. It shouldn't be, logically, just a chain of dominoes. Okay, 6. What would Jesus say? Would he look at me funny if I suggested marriage rights for same-sex couples? I suppose he would suggest that I seek counseling. Perhaps progressives would just shrug it off and dismiss Jesus as a product of his time. Of course, everyone tries to use Jesus as a sock puppet, as you so often pointed out. Maybe progressives have to decide whether Jesus was nothing but a product of his time, or whether his words have meaning for all time, such as when he's made out to be a socialist. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair one. This brings up a huger issue, that if you start limiting the validity of what Jesus says by the limitations imposed by the incarnation, and the possibility of everything he said being conditioned by the limits of his culture, Jesus stops being any kind of revealer. Was his mistaken prediction of the soon coming end of the world merely a product of the influence of contemporary apocalyptic fervor upon him? A lot of people would say, yeah, but what the heck, that was just a limitation of the incarnation. Look, I'm sorry, if he's wrong about that, the only thing he said about heavenly events that one can verify or falsify, then you can't trust any of the stuff that doesn't ring true because it simply sheds light on experience. Of course, there are many wise things said by the Jesus character that click. You say, yeah, I see, forgiveness is important. I hadn't really thought so, but if you put it that way, yeah, right. It has to ring true. You don't just take it by faith as you would if Jim Jones tells you it's time to imbibe some raspberry flavor aid with cyanide. And, well, must be true, he said it. But that's what I'm saying. If you do that, you're just reducing Jesus to the level of some sort of informal moral philosopher. You can agree with and appreciate some things he said. Now, I think that's the way to go. But for theologians to say that, I think they're really sawing off the limb they're sitting on. 7. Progressive atheists, on the one hand, deprecate marriage as unnecessary cultural baggage, but at the same time celebrate the new ruling. Is that an unfair caricature? I don't know, because you'd really have to take a very extensive survey. I know, if I have him right, I think I do, Tom Flynn at the Center for Inquiry, he thinks that formal marriage is pointless, much less having the government authenticate it and all that. Yet I'm sure he was in favor of the gay marriage decision, at least because it's pointing in the right direction. If you're going to have marriage, which it would be better not to have, at least this is better than what it was. So I don't think that's really an inconsistency. 8. What would people in the ancient world make of same-sex marriage? I think I'd have the same debate you do today. Again, we know that a lot of people opposed homosexuality, while a lot of people accepted it. You might have the same divide there. I wouldn't be surprised. 9. The slogan after the court's ruling was "Love wins." But are married persons more in love than non-married persons? Maybe. But I guess what they're saying is if somebody feels that their love will be fulfilled only if they solidify and legitimate this union that maybe they wouldn't think so if there was no marriage to begin with, just informal association. They feel like they're being shut out of it, and they want, I mean, all the stuff married people say about crystallizing and locking in your love and so on for the long haul. I guess that making that possible for same-sex couples is the same thing, and it would be legit to say love has won there. Okay, 10. The one type of union that is impossible to undo and which is completely seamless is the union between two units of the same substance, for example, water and water. On the other hand, only the union of opposites has any creative power, such as electrons and protons or opposite poles on magnets. Then again, to make things more confusing, nuclear weapons rely on critical mass of the same substance. I conclude by asserting that gender is the biggest possible difference between two persons. Yeah, it does seem to me it's pretty complementary. But then again, you might have the same collection of different and complementary personality traits between two women or between two men, and the effect would wind up being the same. Well, thanks. Interesting questions and observations, Kareem. Let's see. Dear Biblius Geekius, the Mushroom here with a few more questions for the Rain Barrel. First, a couple about the Jesus myth theory. I would like to know what are the sources about Jesus having a brother James. So in how many sources do we know that this James and Jesus being brothers? How is this James related to James the Just also? Well, there's this passage in Galatians 2, I think, where Paul says that he went to Jerusalem for a fortnight, and of the apostles met only Cephas and James, the brother of the Lord. Interestingly, he doesn't say brother of Jesus. That's what's usually imagined, though, as in Robert Eisenman's great book on the subject, James, the brother of Jesus, right? Now, there's a huge issue as to whether that means it's actually a physical, biological brother, since various people were called brethren of the Lord with a different connotation. Roman Catholics say that James, son of Zebedee, was the same as James the Just, because they take the brethren of Jesus mentioned in Mark 3 to be cousins. That's a big lexical mess. I think they have to stretch the terminology, but they would say James and John were both cousins of Jesus and therefore, quote, brethren. But Protestants tend not to think that. They think it's a separate guy. There are other statements, depending on who you think is being referred to. In Josephus, it mentions James, the brother of Jesus, called the Christ. There are Nag Hammadi documents. I think the second Apocalypse of James has a discussion of this, where they're trying to say that James, being Jesus' brother, doesn't refer to physical descent, but rather kind of like Thomas, the twin of Jesus, his being spiritually like him and equivalent to him. Eusebius quotes Hegesippus, 2nd century Jewish Christian historian supposedly, who speaks of the martyrdom of James the Just, the brother of Jesus. And there are other ancient 2nd century and later sources that refer to this man. I am not sure we have real evidence that there was a brother of Jesus, though there may well have been, right? And the whole idea of there being a caliphate of James, as Harnack and Stauffer and others have argued, that makes so much sense as a historical analogy of succession disputes and so on at the beginnings of religions that, like in Islam, for example, and Mormonism and the Nation of Islam, black Muslims, that would make sense, that perhaps there was such a person who was a rival of Cephas or Peter for the role. It depends on what you think of the information, if you can call it that, the references to both the 12 and the brothers of Jesus, how literally each is supposed to be taken. It's a bit of a mess. My next question is... Oh, wrong English accent. My next question is about Bart Ehrman and his fixations with qualifications. So is there a best qualification to have to examine if Jesus existed? Is a degree in history any good? It's a history question, so maybe David Fitzgerald would have the correct background. Or does it need to be more specific, so a PhD in ancient history of Greek and Rome, like Dr. Carrier? This would, I think, be the best to say what was happening in the region at the time. If I was to ask, who would be the best to ask about comparing Jesus to known mythical figures in other religions, then would not D.M. Murdoch have better qualifications? Though Richard Carrier is great on that too. Maybe my question is, what is it about being a New Testament scholar specializing in textual analysis, textual criticism, right, which makes that the only good qualification to have to examine the question and if Jesus existed? So can you please explain what is involved in New Testament studies which gives you a grasp on both history and other religions? Well, there are various issues involved here. I don't think textual criticism is one of them that is the most paramount, but I know, as with two other great textual critics, Bruce Metzger and Gordon Fee, that's their specialty, but it sure doesn't prevent them from knowing a heck of a lot about the history of New Testament scholarship and the range of views. And yet that sort of makes your point. You have to, a particular degree in a particular field, it does not necessarily tell the tale. You have to have worked up the expertise to know enough about the ancient similar religions and about the secular history of the time and the methodology of evaluating historical claims. There's nothing about being a text critic that would automatically include that, but it's obvious Bart has applied himself to know a good bit about this. And similarly, Richard Carrier's degree is not specifically in New Testament studies, but he certainly knows enough about it. And the same thing with Acharya and with David Fitzgerald, Earl Doherty. I have to admit, I just do not see why people point to degrees on the wall. It's, if you want to see Doherty's or any of the others' credentials to discuss the issues, look at their books. That's the piece of paper you want, not the one that is or is not in a frame on their wall. Do they know what they're talking about? You can tell that quick enough. If you think it's a bad argument, well, show why it's bad. But you would do that if you're debating things with somebody that does have a degree. To me, that really means nothing, and I'm truly surprised that anybody thinks it does. My final question is, I hope, a fun one. I love the way apologists always say that you can't test God. God does not put on a show for you. What are the good passages in the Bible when God does put on a show? I can think of the show against Pharaoh's court with the 10 plagues, and the contest with the priests of Baal about burning the altar, calling down fire from heaven. Where else does God put on a good show in the Bible? Well, this is kind of minor, but Gideon and his fleece would be an example. Like Gideon is called by God to attack, I think it's the Amalekites, and he didn't want to do it, and he says, I wonder if this is really God. And he prays and says, look, if it is you, and this is your will, I want to put out a sheepskin. And I may have the order mixed up here. In the morning, if the ground around the sheepskin is wet with dew, but the sheepskin is dry, I'll know it's true. Well, it turns out that way. He was hoping it wouldn't. And he says, well, how about this? Best 2 out of 3. How about if tomorrow morning the sheepskin is soaked with dew, but the ground around it is dry? What about that? Well, wouldn't you know it? It happens that way again. And so he figures, okay, I guess I better do it. That'd be one. You might say the resurrection appearances are supposed to be that. I mean, that's certainly the big one apologists give. Jesus said he was God and proved it by rising from the dead. Boy, there's all kinds of stuff wrong with that. The vision that Peter has in Acts chapter 10, I don't want to go talk to those uncircumcised barbarians. And the vision says, hey, don't call unclean what God has called clean. And, in the vision, he sees all kinds of non-kosher goodies, and a voice says, Peter, rise and eat. And he says, not me. I've never eaten non-kosher food. Hey, if God says it's kosher, buddy, you can believe it's kosher. He has to have this vision that is then confirmed by the immediate arrival of Cornelius's people. And so that would be an example. And so God does give, or doubting Thomas, I think all the resurrection appearances have this implicitly, but it's explicit in this one. Hey, I'm sorry, you say you saw the risen Jesus? Sure. I'm only going to believe it if I see him and can probe the nail holes and so on. And bingo, there he is. So there are some like that. Too bad they don't happen anymore, huh? Oh, let's see. Thanks, Mushroom. Lachlan Cristante, Vampire Predator, says, am I skipping something here? No. Back during the ham on Nye debate, whoa, I realized my normally liberal and docetist mother-in-law was a full-on young creationist. I tried to explain just how evil her God must be in a literalist interpretation of the Bible, and quickly came up with the explanation that the Noachian flood is a metaphor for baptism, the cleansing of sin by water. At the time, it was an off-the-cuff apologetic made up on the stop in order to throw a spanner into the works and make her look at the Bible as a mystery rather than a history. With that in mind, have I said something with any merit? The purpose of baptism always eluded me, as unlike the wine and bread of communion, there's no transubstantiational element, although water does have a visible cleansing effect with or without soap. Well, the problem with this is, as far as I know, immersion baptism in Judaism was pretty late, centuries later than the flood story. Of course, the flood story is remote. It's archaic in its first appearances in Babylonian and Assyrian, Sumerian epics and all that, and the Bible seems dependent upon them. In fact, in a really fascinating book by Russell Gmirkin, if I'm saying that right, a book called Berosus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus, he makes a very convincing case that Genesis 1 through 11 is largely based on Berosus, his work, Babyloniaca, I think it is, written in Greek, but the guy was a Babylonian archivist and had access to old cuneiform materials, and his translation of them is the only way we know about several of these things. And it looks like, it's kind of like Acts, Luke and Acts using Josephus. There's not only an overlap, but it's like Luke Acts doesn't seem to know any other stuff about Jewish rebels against Rome than what we still read in Josephus. And whoever wrote the Pentateuch, or in this case the beginning of Genesis, doesn't seem to have known much of anything beyond what one can find in Berosus, which is a 3rd century BC work. And so it pushes everything pretty much later. But even that would make it, much too early for Jewish proselyte baptism, much less that of John the Baptist or the early Christians. 1 Peter does make baptism analogous to the flood, but the flood, though it could have been symbolic earlier, seems to have been put forth as an attempt at history. I think all the myth tellers weren't saying, well, of course you and I know the Jungian significance of this. I think they really did mean that there was this devastating flood that destroyed the world as they knew it. Now, there are flood stories all over the world, and almost all of them come from civilizations right on a river, which gives you a big hint as to why they're similar. Let's see, baptism is the symbol of cleansing, but what it has to do with the flood is, I think, secondary. But you're thinking in a good critical, theological way. This is John Brockman, the cute one, not the famous one. I don't happen to know who the famous one is. We have two incompatible genealogies for Jesus, so I suppose it's fortunate we have two Jesuses. Jeeses? Joshes? In the Gospels, Jesus ben Joseph and Jesus Barabbas. Sure, according to some old Latin manuscripts of Matthew, it's, who will you have me release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus called the Christ? Sure, it would be a coincidence to have two men named Jesus both descended from a guy named Joseph, each of whom happens to be a descendant of David, but hey, Josh and Joe were really popular names, and after 1,000 years, David probably had 5 billion descendants anyhow. Or for a bit more fun, you could say that Jesus and Jesus were brothers, and Barabbas was named Barabbas because he's the one who was actually the son of Joseph, or the son of the father, just to sort of twit the Almighty. Sure, you're God, and I've got to do what you say, or whatever, but I do kind of resent you knocking up my child bride, you jerk. Well, somebody has seriously suggested that there were two Jesuses, and the genealogies apply to both. I'm thinking of Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, who believed that, according to the Akashic records, I forget which is which, but one of the nativity story Jesuses was the reincarnation of Solomon, and the other the reincarnation of Zoroaster, and so that each truly did have this genealogy. But one of them died early on, and his spirit went into the other one in the manner of a Tibetan Buddhist tulku, like a lama who has more than one reincarnated essence of different previous lamas or bodhisattvas. So it's sort of a joke, but I'm not sure who the joke is on, since in almost every theory you can think of, even as a joke, turns out to be seriously held by somebody. Let's see. From Jim K. I initially came to Jesus mythicism, hallelujah, as a skeptic. I had already rejected the God of the Bible as being mythological, but assumed, as I believe most atheists do, that a man named Jesus walked around doing tricks and was the source of the gospel narratives. It was only after reading Nailed, 10 Christian Myths that show Jesus never existed at all by David Fitzgerald, fine book, that I was hit squarely in the face with the fact that there were no contemporary writers found during Jesus' supposed lifetime. I find the mythicism hypothesis very compelling and quite convincing, so I've followed the work of you, David Fitzgerald, and Dr. Richard Carrier very closely, but there is one piece of data that seems to be ignored by you three scholars, but not by Kenneth Humphreys of JesusNeverExisted.com. And that data are the various locations named in the Gospels that don't seem to exist on maps compiled in the 1st century. Origen and others had trouble finding the various locations named in the Gospels on the ground around Galilee. This makes perfect sense in a mythological rubric, but no sense in a historical one. So I wonder why the mythicist community doesn't add this to the list of supporting data on mythicism. Is it because the other arguments are more compelling than this one? Was it common in antiquity to get the names of cities and towns wrong? Let me just point out, by the way, this is a real interesting argument. Frank Zindler has written about this for a long time, evidence that Capernaum and other gospel towns didn't exist. Like, nobody knows what the heck Dalmanutha is supposed to be, for instance. And so Frank has carried the banner for this, too. Continuing, I know you have mentioned the lack of evidence of Nazareth at the time of Jesus, and you've also talked about how Joseph of Arimathea basically translates to Joseph of Best Disciple Town. I believe that's Richard Carrier's insight, though I have stolen it. And credited Dr. Carrier. But what about all the other locations? Aren't most of these towns and cities named incorrectly? Or do you and the others think that Mr. Humphreys is exaggerating? I think he's right, and I forget how many of these towns that Frank Zindler dealt with in a paper called Where Jesus Never Walked. It's contained in, I forget which volume of his 4-volume set, a collection of his essays called Through Atheist Eyes, published by American Atheist Press, who sadly will not be publishing any paper 3-dimensional books anymore, only e-books. But this one does exist in print, and you'd find loads of interest in that. There is a short video from Kenneth Humphreys on YouTube that listeners can find called Jesus in Wonderland that summarizes some of the naming issues that have confounded historians over the centuries. https://www.youtube.com/watch?v=1 capital U 80 capital H small k capital L small b capital THI. Just curious about your thoughts. Thanks. Yeah, I think he's on the right track. There is some reason, I think, to doubt a lot of that stuff. Could possibly be because they wanted to avoid the problem of a prophet being honored everywhere except his hometown. Well, you're going to go and check what happened to Jesus at these towns if they're not even on the map? Maybe not. This is from Robert, the Almost Physicist. I'm sure I'm not going to have anything to say about this, but I want to share it with you. I believe that I've found an analogy between the related concepts of Trinitarianism and modalism and some elements of quantum field theory that I've found quite enlightening. I'd like you to please comment on any errors of my thinking on Trinitarianism and modalism you may detect. I will be describing my idea in terms of quantum electrodynamics, as that is the simplest form of field theory and the one with which I'm most familiar. In quantum electrodynamics, one fundamental entity is the electron field. This field can manifest to us in many forms. It can be detected as a single particle, the electron. It can have properties of a wave, such as diffraction and interference. It can even act collectively as many electrons in combination, with nuclei to form a crystal, liquid, or person. In this way, I think that the electron field exhibits modalism. It is one entity that can be observed in many forms. The existence of the electron field implies the existence of another field, the photon field. This implication proceeds beautifully from the principle that the laws of nature should not depend on how we describe them. The so-called principle of gauge invariance. Anyway, the photon field can also appear in many forms. The most common to us is the form of light, but it can also appear as a particle, the photon. So the photon field also exhibits modalism. The key is that the existence of one requires the existence of the other in order for us to observe them as they are in reality. Without the photon field, the electron field would just appear to be independent particles flying through space at an unchanging velocity. The photon field animates the electron field and allows it to take complex forms, making up everything we see and touch and breathe. Without the electron field, there would be no substance to the universe, no way to detect the passage of time. Thus, we have two entities, the electron field and photon field, which are like the persons of the Trinity. Each can take many forms and are thus modal. They are also fundamentally different and distinct, the most important distinction being that the electron field is a fermion field and the photon field is a boson field. However, they exist as two parts of a unity, interdependent and inseparable. One cannot be understood without the other, and together they are more than simply the sum of two halves. Together they give rise to all of the beautiful complexity around us, even though when considered separately, they're pretty boring and static. Anyway, I could go on and on about this stuff, but I think I've conveyed my idea. Let me know what you think. Keep on geeking. P.S. I've decided to do a deep read of the Gospel of Mark, and on the recommendation of you and the trickster, I've ordered Fowler's Let the Reader Understand. Questions on that will be forthcoming. Yes, indeed, I definitely recommend that book. It is great. It is eye-opening. It is revolutionary. As to the physics, it sounds good, but I have so limited an understanding that the only thing I can of physics is the only thing I can understand is perhaps without analogy here in what you've said is the difficulty in Trinitarianism of defining persons, because originally I think it was Boethius. Personhood, well, at first with Tertullian, personhood was close to the meaning of the Latin word on which it's based, persona, or plural personae, which meant a role, the mask an actor would wear in ancient theater, this laughing and the frowning masks and so on. And that would sound kind of modalistic. But Boethius, I believe it was he, was the first one to specify that it was some kind of a center of consciousness. And that doesn't necessarily include full personhood of the kind we speak of when we talk about psyching somebody out and personality inventory tests and so forth. But it seems to me that's where you run into trouble, because if you say you have a divine being with three personalities, then you're running the risk of tritheism. Why is that not another way of saying there are three gods? What does the unity mean except that they're part of the same category? And that difficulty, I'm not sure, is addressed. But again, you're probably right and I'm probably wrong. I wouldn't bet 5 cents on my understanding of anything having to do with quantum physics. Thanks a bunch. Appreciate it. And I admire your grasp of the topic. Ooh, let's see. Okay, I think I'm done on the Geek for today. I got a real good one coming up from David Oliver Smith, author of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul. But it's kind of long and complex, so I think I'll start out with that next time. And I'll be seeing you soon on the next exciting episode of The Bible Geek. It's The Bible Geek, Robert M. Price.